How does the exercise of Nietzsche's dark wisdom stand uh, vis-a-vis the division between the hard sciences and, let's say, the less hard sciences, for want of saying the social sciences or the humanities or some other phrase? I give an example from the recent truly long form discussion between Peterson and Joe Rogan. Peterson as example of somebody practicing the semi hard sciences, as it were, making double blind or double plus blind experiments on the basis of certain group standards, um, to do with the representative quality of the data and to do with what data is to be accepted and other such standards. Um, we can allow those standards in themselves to stand as fairly cogent, I believe. Where we get into trouble is things such as were, by analogy, raised in other survey like social sciences experiments, as it were. Although I suppose we want to distinguish experiments proper from just data gathering in sociology or so. Um, One thing they were talking about was this science gossip, which was supposedly at the time taken as hard science, which is this finding that rats will always keep going back to cocaine if a certain proportion of it is given to them. But then that was criticized on the basis of as Rogan brought out, on the basis that only in a cage or so, or in certain very limited environments would that happen, but not when they were at large. Okay, so there's that kind of problem. But now I want to hone in on a more subtle zone, which is more in the Nietzschean area, which is insisting on the definition of technical terms, which are then passed off as terms of ordinary usage, which could be used in normal life in a way which is um, basically imposes the scientific notion, superimposes it over the term as it's primarily used. So the example we have here is the word impulsive. Um, Once you try to give a technical definition to a word like impulsive, so Peterson is saying the definition, without further qualification, he says the definition of impulsive is how much you discount the future. And then he gives some examples concerning a manner of experiment which can be made, uh, asking people whether they take $50 now or $500 later, and other variants like that. And then I'm assuming there's a whole great variegated variety of sundry of uh, experiments that have been run on this impulsivity notion. And I suppose impulsive is also part of his, I think he does the Big Five personality test, something um, derived ultimately from Carl Jung, if I'm not mistaken about that. But in any case, I'm not thinking so much about the data with regard to the personality test, although I suppose that could be experimental also in some way. I'm not sure of the details of that. But I think more of, if you're doing experiments that are more like the rat experiment, more like hard science experiments, and then the subtlety is you've decided how to understand a term which is an ordinary language term, impulsive, in a way that then you're coming back and saying, well, impulsive people are like this, like this, like this. I give a blunt example of that. The way we use the word emotional. So, like, some people are emotional, and then supposedly the tradition is against being emotional. So shouldn't we just rule out everything emotional people say a priori? Because we know who they are. So we know that Dwayne Johnson is like more of an emotional guy uh, than is Leonard Nimoy or whatever, or than is Noam Chomsky. Noam Chomsky is not a very emotional man, so he must be right about the greater part of what he says, right? No, I don't think so. I think that's a result of treating a notion, which is part of the tradition of criticizing pathos or passion, and especially in connection to two problems. One, Theoria looking at something from the balcony at the stage below, or two, the question of a mother who she may know that her son is a terrible person, but because it's her son, she has an interest there. So the law says we can't accept her testimony out of hand. So likewise, Peterson, who's actually run this kind of experiment, you can see this is how it's actually happening. People just invent a new definition for a term that's being used in daily life, impulsive, and then they tell you we have the objective meaning of impulsivity, and that displaces all ordinary experience. So then you're starting to think the people who really know what impulsivity are the ones that have run these representative experiments, and only they have hard data on it, which is their observations have been accepted by a group of accredited technicians, such as Jordan Peterson. Anything else, anything that happened to you or I in our daily life, is then said to be anecdote, or under the joke that the plural of anecdote is not data, they call it anecdata. Then you get all actual experience rather than experiment, which is only the province of people who are accredited to say what is objective data and what is not, what is acceptable and what is not. Set off experience with experiment. Experience means the whole of life. Experiment means the rat in the cage acting weird, because that's the way you can get the experiment repeated more or less, although you're dealing with different rats each time with different personalities. And then what they do with that is, if they get a rat that's acting really weird and not taking even in the cage, not taking the portion of cocaine, then they say this data point is it's noise. It's a static noise. That doesn't fit in with our probability distribution. That would be bad it would make our paper look less credible. Let's throw that out and do some new experiments where we don't happen to use a rat that doesn't fit in with the probability expectation. Things like that happen all the time. So here, this kind of notion, his notion of what impulsivity means, which is quite cogent in its own way. It's an interesting concept, but it takes us out of ordinary usage. So this notion of discounting the future, and then he gives some statements which I think are self-contradictory, where they're self-contradictory, where he's saying it's impossible to work out this equation, but at the same time we can say some people are doing it. It's sort of as though he's implying some people are doing it better, because if we take into account that some environment may objectively call for more skepticism, more discounting of the future, unless we have an objective place to start with, how can you say the person is more impulsive rather than the situation objectively demands a greater discount of the future? It demands that you take the $50 now instead of the $500 later. In that sense, I think there's a problem with the concept he's pushing, but on the whole, it's fairly cogent. But the point is that it replaces that meaning of impulsive with what we actually mean by impulsive in daily life. So the Kristen Stewart, for instance, says that she's very impulsive. And what she means is that she engages in basically in social behavior more, I think, more impulsively than most people. I think also the phrase impulsive buying is more. I'm not sure how Peterson can tie the phrase impulsive buying, which is just sort of not that I stop and deliberate and discount or not discount the future, but I just do it spontaneously. I suppose you can say, even if they don't see, that's where you get into this Nietzschean problem. Plato or Aristotle would say, if you don't stop and think about it, that's not a deliberate act, that's not even a human action. Whereas this kind of concept, you can say, first we'll just look at what the person does, and then we'll superimpose the idea over them as though they had done it deliberatively, thoughtfully. You can engage in all kinds of different starting points, and then you can project it back all the way to the beginning of time and sort of forget that you've done that. And this is where Nietzsche comes in, where he's saying you're sort of sub-nihilistic, because you're not aware that you're a nihilist. You think what you're doing is you've discovered the truth, and then you're just superimposing it over the whole history of mankind, as you should, because everything that was thought in the past was false. Everyone in the past lived in a delusion, and now we know how to understand what impulsive really means. Or you could make that subtle change and say, okay, impulsive is just a technical term and it just means this. But nonetheless, you're saying this, which we're studying about the discounting of the past or not discounting the past, is the truth. And then you could see the whole past through that lens and then ultimately say, that's what they were actually doing. They just didn't know it. You throw it on top of them. You say their lives were led like somebody who didn't know that the earth turns. They thought the earth stands still, or they didn't know that the sun is moving. They didn't know that the earth is moving around the sun. They lived in their life in a delusion, but now we've made an improvement. So then you have reached what Nietzsche would call this super historical ground. You think you're in eternity because you're in possession of the truth that you can then put here. You could read that into any situation, any time. What Nietzsche says is, this is the less dimension. This is the last man. He still thinks he has the truth. He said the Superman, the Ubermensch, is the one that realizes, no, I'm just reading a strong emotion that I'm really sure about something into all places and all time and treating it as though it were an eternal colored petri dish lens that I could put over everything, and it will always be there in the mind of God and for all future generations. It's this not knowing that you're doing that, which accounts for the notion of the life-giving lie. And so if you have a certain passion, you really want to do that, it drives your life, etc., you do that. That's what Nietzsche means by the Macht Geschichte. That's what Nietzsche means by power. It's this that fuels life. That fuels life, so it gives you the motive force, which in Catholic thinking is called faith. So it gives you the motive force that fuels your life, and which, if you didn't have it, your life would be worse. So it's better for you if you tell yourself that this is the truth. Life-giving lie, Nietzsche calls it. So so I think this, maybe if you would listen to it again after thinking of the Nietzschean overlay of it, you could sort of evaluate and see, are scientists, at least in this sort of, not physics, not chemistry, but in these sort of psychological experiments, guilty of this kind of sort of sub-nihilistic mindset where they don't realize that they're nihilists.